So we're here with this sort of, our camera's a bit sort of leg focused.
Okay, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you here join us. I'm delighted that we can have this talk today on AI minds and governance framework. And today we are joined by two amazing speakers and a host. So for those who haven't met me yet, my name is Dr. John Adenitire. I'm a senior lecturer in the law school, and I'm a co-director of the Forum on Decentering the Human, which is a new research center in the Institute for in the Humanities and Social Sciences, the Faculty for Humanities and Social Sciences. This talk today, as well as the series on bridging buildings, building bridges, excuse me, is co-organized with Mario Slugan of the Global Epistemologies project. And today we have three speakers, one of whom is online, Professor Sandra Wachter, who will be speaking in a moment. Professor Sandra Wachter is a professor of technology and regulation at Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford, at the University of Oxford, where she researches the legal and ethical implications of AI, big data, and robotics, as well as internet and platform regulation. Current research focuses on profiling, inferential analytics, explainable AI, algorithmic bias, diversity and fairness, as well as governmental surveillance, predictive policing, human rights online, and health tech and medical law. In short, she's an expert. We also have Professor Jack Stilgoe, who is a professor in science and technology at UCL, where he researches the governance of emerging technologies. He's part of the UKRI Responsible AI Leadership Team. He was principal investigator of the ESRC Driverless Futures Project, and among other publications is the author of Who is Driving Innovation and Experiment Earth, Responsible Innovation in Geoengineering. And these are our two main speakers, but we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Elke Schwarz. I hope I pronounced that sufficiently okay. Who is a reader in political theory here at Queen Mary. And prior to Queen Mary, she lectured at the University of Leicester. She has a PhD from the LSE, and she has also taught at UCL and Anglia Ruskin. She's the author of Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies, which was published with Manchester University Press. And she's an RSA fellow and a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms. Okay, so Dr. Schwarz will be leading the discussion, and I'm going to pass on the microphone to her.
Smallest microphone I've ever seen in my entire life.
You can keep it to yourself.
I might. For now, I'm just going to hold it. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, John, for making the introductions and also for the invitation to chair this panel. I will be moderating and chairing, so I will not, hopefully, will not be speaking too much. It's wonderful to meet you, Jack, and also Sandra, at least virtually. I think I'm going to go ahead with the first question, which is, of course, for both of you. It's a very basic question, but I think if we speak about artificial intelligence and regulation, it is not an unimportant question. And that is, what is AI in your definition, right? If you are asked what is artificial intelligence, how do you respond to that? What are the key characteristics? Just a few words on that, perhaps.
Oh, a few words.
It's a few words, yes. Just to warm us up.
Yeah, so I guess just just to position this. So I'm a sociologist. I have no particular commitments to AI. I didn't sort of grow up in an AI sort of discipline, community, culture. So I approach AI in a tradition that comes from science and technology studies of looking at emerging technologies. So when I look at, I sort of, we social scientists often talk about sort of problematizing things. When we see an emergent sort of social issue, we look for analogies. So when I look at AI, I actually don't try and offer any sort of technical definition. Right? There's all sorts of definitions that we can take from history, from computer scientists about what AI means, what AI is, and there are some critical definitions that say, it's AI until it works, and then it just becomes something meaningful. So they might emphasize that AI is a sort of futuristic, hype-filled type idea. For me, I see AI as the next, in most general terms, the next big thing, right? It's a social phenomenon that is attracting huge amounts of cultural and social financial capital. It is a build-up of a concentration of power. And I think that probably tells us more about the novelty and interest and why we're talking about AI than anything, than any definition that is based in, neural networks, transformer models, or sort of tries to give any sort of technical roots to the sort of the definition thing. But Sandra will know more about this than I do. So I have intentionally withholding judgment about the technical novelty of AI, because normally people like me, when we see technology people saying this is what a technology is, we might just be suspicious that we're being sold something.
Yeah. Sandra.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the issue is that, there is no coherent or no agreed upon definition of AI, not in technology, not in law, not in philosophy. So it's not like you could just open up the dictionary and find a definition that everybody would agree upon, which is part of the problem. However, the way that I think about it, or how I make sense about it in my head, and where I distinguish between the things that worry me and the things that don't worry me, is that I think of them in terms of capability. So I think about algorithms that are quite mundane, in the sense that they are rule-based. So that means I give certain rules to an algorithm and I expect it to execute that. Something like a very fancy calculator. I tell it 2 and 2 is 4, and then it just executes this. Like, this is a very easy example. Obviously, the examples can be much more complicated than that, but I'm the one that makes the rules, and that thing is just executing what it wanted to do, which is a type of algorithm, less problematic. Now, machine learning, the interesting thing about this is that I don't have to tell it the rules. I just tell it what I want it to do, right? I wanted to find the best person for a job. I want to find out who I should give a loan to. I want to find out who's the best student for a scholarship. And I just throw in a bunch of data and tell the algorithm, find me that best person, and you, the algorithm, find the rules for that. I give you rule-making authority, if that makes sense. And so that is where it gets exciting and problematic, and maybe a little bit, murky, because I get an output after having put some input in, and what happens in the middle is a thing that I don't really know about. So the thing machine learns by itself and comes up with its own rules and makes decisions based on that. So the advantage is then that it can make decisions based on data that I would never think to consider. I can look at somebody's social media profile, for example, or whatever other million data points that I have, and that thing will find something out about it, and has the ability to look at massive amounts of data that I would never have the time and the resources to do by myself. But the issue is that I don't understand the rules that it makes up while doing that. And that can then lead to a problem. And this is why it's really important to think about machine learning and AI, because the rules that it applies are no longer fully understandable to us.
Okay, yes, great, thank you. Yes, it is interesting. Every time I think about artificial intelligence or somebody asks me about it, it is anything from like, well, it is machine learning, it's statistics, to, well, it is a floating signifier ultimately, that you can just like package anything into it. And that is really, I think, but you know more about this than I do, the crunch point for both policy and regulation in some way. Now, in the last 12 months, ChatGPT and large language models and generative AI have really taken up the headlines, have really occupied most of the discourses on artificial intelligence. But there are, of course, many, many other applications, use cases, types of AI or AI programs. Where do you see the problems with that? Is that just a wave? Is it going to go away? What are the challenges that reside in the simple fact that we hear so much about certain AI projects that are then hyped and produce the hype versus other modes of application or areas of application that fall into the category of hype, but do actually much more productive stuff than ChatGPT?
Yeah. Do you want me to have a go at that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, it has been strange. So let me just sort of juxtapose, I guess, ChatGPT and that sort of wave of hype. I mean, it's all hype upon hype upon hype. So I've spent the last 5 years looking at one specific case study of AI in the wild, which is self-driving cars. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at that technology is to try to ground some of this discussion, to try to think, what are when we're actually talking about the uses of AI in the real world and can have a conversation not just about what it is doing, what it will do, but also how it works and the challenge of explaining how it works to the satisfaction of a range of stakeholders around it, and understanding its purposes as well, what it's actually for and who's benefiting, we can then have a governance discussion. Actually, one of the interesting things about the last 6 months has been the UK Parliament starting to legislate on rules for self-driving cars with AI at the center of that problematic. Now, more recently, as you say, we have the arrival of large language models, generative AI, and a lot of people talk about that set of technologies as so-called general purpose technologies, which, I mean, there are historical precedents for talking about general purpose technologies around things like industrial revolutions and the creation of new platforms and infrastructures upon which new social and technical orders can be based. Ascribing a general purpose technology label to a technology in real time is problematic, though, because it suggests, well, if this technology can do everything, right, if it genuinely is an intelligence, then it becomes impossible to hold that technology to account, right? It becomes impossible to say, well, who's benefiting? What is this thing actually for? What are the business models likely to be, right? We're then playing into the hands of a tiny number of largely Silicon Valley-based companies who want to sell us the next big thing without being asked those difficult questions about who the actual winners and losers are. So the issue that I have with large language models, the debate about ChatGPT, is that so much of that debate centers on this question of, well, how intelligent is it? And for me as a technology policy person, that is a real distraction, because I think, the actual question is, how useful is it? To whom is it useful? Who wins? Who loses? Who's making the decisions? Where's the power? Those sorts of things. The discussion about intelligence, sentience, consciousness, creativity is philosophically interesting, and it might have implications for a range of stakeholders. In terms of governance, I think it's mostly a distraction.
Yeah, Sandra.
Yeah, I think at least, again, this is how I sorted in my head. I categorize the risks that I see and the ones that I actually believe in and the ones that I think are overstated, depending on how the technology works. And with AI, we can roughly distinguish between like predictive AI and generative AI. So predictive AI is AI that is being used, or that is used very often to help you make decisions. So this is like, who should I give the loan to? Who should I hire? Who should I fire? Who am I going to send to prison? So classification systems that basically say dog, cat, that type of stuff, right? There is a set of problems that very often comes with those types of algorithms, one of which is that they're often black boxes, so I don't understand why and how they make decisions. They're often riddled with bias because they're trained on historical data that picks up the unfairness of the past. And then we have an issue with privacy, obviously, because it's collecting and analyzing a bunch of data. So there is a lot to be done and thought about how we deal with systems that are inherently racist, sexist, ableist, heteronormative, and black boxes if we allow them to make decisions about life-changing events about people, like who has to go to prison, who gets a loan, who's allowed to go to university, who gets cancer treatment, that type of stuff. So there is a very concrete sector-specific risk analysis that needs to be done of who is benefiting in those areas and who are the winners and who are the losers. Looking at generative AI, again, that is also AI, but what you get out of it looks a little bit different. It's not necessarily there to help you make decisions, but it's there to create something. So it's there to create text or audio or video or audio video, basically. And so the risk and opportunities look a little bit different. It also has issues with bias, and it also has issues with questions of privacy and then discrimination, but they manifest a little bit differently. But in addition to that, that type of system has other things that we wouldn't necessarily see with algorithms being used for criminal justice purposes. For example, generative AI has the issue of hallucinations, right? So it just makes up stuff that doesn't actually exist. You interact with ChatGPT and you ask it a question and it gives you an answer that sounds really, really convincing and is completely wrong. And you might not know that it's made up, that it's not rooted in fact. And then this can then lead, for example, to misinformation on a much higher scale. It can lead to reputational damage of some sort because you might be spreading misinformation about people, about things that have never happened. There is a question of intellectual property rights of the data that it is being trained upon. And so those are the things that I worry about with those types of technology. So one is really more about how does it affect the lives of people when important decisions are being made with an opaque system. And the other one is more societal, like how do we conceptualize truth and trust if we all of a sudden have like tools that are spreading a lot of nonsense and might be also be used to replace some jobs in the future. And so again, depending on what that thing can and cannot do, that's how I think about risk. And I think some are connected, but some are very, very distinct and therefore require different regulatory attention.
Can I just
Absolutely.
follow up on
Sure.
Sandra's, because I think that distinction is key for in sort of regulatory terms. There's a set of ideas from the history of technology, though, that slightly trouble the distinction between predictive and generative, which is that long before the word generative was being used to apply to AI, it was being used to think about how technologies shape social futures. And technologies are in their own way generative. They're generative of particular futures. And there, Sandra, an earlier comment that you made about, maybe the core problematic here, which I think is right, is about the delegation of rulemaking authority to these things, and in effect an implicit set of norms about who should and shouldn't be liable. The delegation of that to machines, which is extremely convenient for some people, maybe across these various types of AI. Whether you are a self-driving car company seeking to exculpate yourself from liability in the event of a crash, or you're a generative AI image generation company who doesn't want to pay for the data that you're scraping to generate your images. In both of those cases, the model, and it's a sort of social, political, economic model, might unite all of them, which is about taking these awkward social norms and responsibilities and hiding them in a black box. So that sort of intentional irresponsibility that might be a feature of AI. I mean, we just saw, I don't know if anybody followed the news that came out last week about the Israel Defense Forces use of, and we don't, I don't know how sophisticated the algorithms are, but they don't actually need to be very sophisticated as a set of algorithms to provide military decision makers with a list of targets, right? What the actual social function of that is to take responsibility away from the humans that normally have responsibility in war. I mean, you know more about this than I do, Elke, but it seems like that's one way that AI is already playing a role in the world, is by troubling all of those norms about where we locate responsibility.
Yeah, I think the revelations about Lavender and some other strangely named AI systems that are in use pick something up that I and many others have been talking about for the last decade or so. And this is the question of responsibility, or outsourcing responsibility, or just distancing oneself, in the sense of, we have social norms, we have certain norms that we usually adhere to, but you have this interface that also allows a distancing mechanism, which is implicit in all. Well, that's not true. Maybe not. That's implicit in some AI systems and some perhaps less. So I want to pivot a little bit. I want to pick up this question of irresponsibility in a moment. And with that also responsible AI, which you are a lead on the responsible AI program. But since I have two wonderful experts here, where do you see the greatest potential for beneficial use of AI? Both of you mentioned the question, who benefits, which is a very complex question to be followed up immediately, but with what kind of benefit, right? Financial benefit we can see. But where do you see the most fruitful application of artificial intelligence in our social and political domain?
Yeah. So one thing that social scientists like me, we resist is anything sort of predictive and technologically deterministic. So I would just sort of tweak that question a little bit, rather than saying, what could AI do? What benefits could it have? And in particular, I mean, my interest is always in how to make technologies fairer, more just, so questions of how technology can benefit marginalized communities, the world's poorest people, they're always the sort of starting point for how I think about technologies. So I would therefore rejig that question a bit, just to say, what would it take for artificial intelligence to have greater benefits for those people, recognizing that despite the rhetoric, the trend is for technologies to widen inequalities, not to narrow them. So what would it take for AI to have benefits to people in the world's poorest communities? I think is a really interesting, really hard challenge. I can see areas of potential. I can see areas of potential to, for example, open up access to authoritative information and education to a much wider range of people. I can see opportunities to bring non-traditional players into innovation, to create new sorts of solutions that suit particular local cultures. I can see AI being used in all those sorts of ways. But in order to do that, we have to, rather than just presume that will happen, right? We have to govern it. We have to steer AI. AI left to its own devices, driven by what is a very, very small number of very powerful players at the moment, will not do that. And we shouldn't pretend that it will do that. And any rhetoric that comes out of the benefits of AI trickling down naturally to people at the bottom of the pyramid, just we need to challenge it.
Sandra, what are your thoughts on this? I know that you've worked a lot on fairness and unfairness and discrimination. Where do you see the most beneficial use, maybe as a sector or domains in which AI is very useful, and others, or has the least potential for unfair outcomes?
Yes, so I think your question, even though it sounds simple, is I think one of the most important questions that we have to ask ourselves as humans and as regulators. because the core question is beneficial to whom? And so that means at the philosophical end, like, why do we innovate? Why do we even want to use algorithms in the first place? And like in a very simplistic binary way, if you look at the discourse, there's two reasons why this is being done, or why people would want to do that. Either because they want to automate an existing process, make it faster, make it cheaper, make it more efficient, or because they want a technology to fix a problem that they see. And so depending on which side you go and why, like what your compass is that guides you, you will see who will benefit from it. In my opinion, unfortunately, a lot of the attention is being put on the first one, where it's just about trying to cut costs as much as possible, trying to streamline existing processes without having the intention to improve current processes. And this is also the reason why AI is being deployed very often in the sectors that are having the most financial struggles. So this is the criminal justice sector, this is immigration, this is education, this is healthcare. This is where AI is being readily deployed, because it's not about finding better ways to make asylum decisions. It's about working with a limited budget to make those decisions. And so that's where the issue is, because you're not actually thinking about how to make better decisions. You're trying to find a way to make them cheaper and more efficient. However, if you think about innovation in a different way, and if you think the thing I want to fix is not the budget hole, the thing that I want to fix is the way how we make decisions, because I'm not happy how we give out scholarships, and I'm not happy how the criminal justice is working, and I don't think people get enough cancer treatment if they want that, then you can design technology in a way to improve that. But that's a conscious decision that you cannot just do afterwards, after you've deployed it. That's a design decision that has to happen in the lab already. Like, what is the problem that you actually want to fix? So if the mindset was changing, if the incentive structure were to change, if regulation was nudging towards ethical innovation mindset, then we would create technologies that actually help you be more efficient with cancer treatment and find the better students for universities and make sure that nobody that's innocent actually goes to prison. But again, this is like the decision that you have to make at the top. And I think we don't often do that enough. We just implement it because it's there without asking us the question, what it is that we actually want to fix.
Yeah, I like this notion of casting it as like, what is it we want to fix? That's a really, really important question. Jack, last year you published a piece in Science, which proposes the Weizenbaum test. In contrast to the Turing test. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, because there's also a lot of questions attached to that.
Yeah, so this was a sort of, I was exasperated, I guess, at this debate about AI that focused on this question of intelligence. Is it intelligent? And, you know, people playing around with ChatGPT when that was launched, going, oh, what can it do? How intelligent is it? You know, isn't it creepy? And this sort of sense of uncanniness, this sense that there was something sort of magical going on. And that all seemed like smoke and mirrors compared to the actual question going to do. And I went back to, I mean, he's sort of tragically a rather forgotten figure in the history of AI, even though he was hugely important. Joseph Weizenbaum was actually the creator of the first chatbot, basically, a thing called ELIZA, very simple system in the 60s and 70s. And Joseph Weizenbaum was developing chatbots and realized that what happened when you created even these very simple things that basically bounced back people's prompts to them is that people anthropomorphized these systems, and they became dangerous, not because of what they could do, but because of the qualities that people attributed to them. And Weizenbaum wrote a lot about, you know, giving a critical analysis of early AI systems. And a lot of those critiques have subsequently been forgotten, which is, I think, a real shame. His book, Computer Power and Human Reason, I would recommend to anybody. But he actually did a few sort of op-eds, including one in Science magazine, where I published this piece. And he said, the question is not, is it intelligent, right? That's not the important question for society. That might be important if you're a computer scientist, if you're an AI researcher, that might be the thing that drives you and it might really excite you. The question for society is it good? Is it useful? And that takes us down the path that Sandra is describing as well, which is sometimes called technology assessment. How do you make sense? How do societies make sense of new technologies? How do they ask those questions so that they can then make good decisions about them, make individual decisions about, should I use this thing? Can I trust this thing? If I'm a student that wants to cheat on my essay, should I make use of this thing? But also if you're a government trying to make decisions about a technology on behalf of the society, how should this be regulated? And it's amazing that those very simple questions, the sorts of questions that Sandra and I have been raising, there's all sorts of incentives to not ask them. And I guess that was the point I was making.
Yes, there's in the list of questions that you highlight in the article, there's one question that says, what are the implications, not just in financial, economic, or international security terms, but on human life or human society? And I think for me, this is the quintessential question. And a lot of the discussion on responsible artificial intelligence should foreground that question, because ultimately, maybe the responsible thing is to not use AI rather than, try and make something that we then make fit to something that it doesn't fit. And I'm saying this because in your article, you also have one quote of Weizenbaum who says that extremely short exposure to a relatively simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in people. So there is something about AI, cybernetic technologies, that those thinkers about, digital technologies in the early years have highlighted. There is something very strange about how we interact with that technology. Yeah. And I wonder, and this is a question to both of you, I wonder if there's a tension perhaps in trying to make a policy regulate a technology that ultimately, as the philosopher Günther Anders once said, it's designed to function without us, to replace us cognitively, physically in some ways, right? So how do you regulate that which we don't know what's going to happen to us humans with those institutions that are ultimately human institutions?
Given that's such a big one. Sandra, do you want to have the first?
See what you make of that.
I get the easy one first. Fantastic. Yeah, so I think it's a really, really essential question, and it's really interesting to see how governments are responding to this. And I think, the question is really complicated, because like every technology is better at something than I am. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good technology. Like a submarine is much better at diving, and a plane is better at flying, and a calculator is better at maths than I am. And that's great, right? That's discovery, that's human endeavor, that's shared knowledge. It's amazing that we could bring forth those technologies and how they help us. So just because something is better than I am doesn't necessarily mean that it is a threat, right? What I see as a threat is that, again, coming back to that dichotomy of like, are we trying to cut costs? Are we trying to improve something? If the main focus is on trying to cut costs, there's a clear incentives of going after the jobs of people just because you want to save money, right? Because if you all of a sudden have an algorithm that can do a similar task just as good as you, maybe better, at half the time, and doesn't need sick leave or holidays, or doesn't get tired or grumpy and doesn't talk back, then there's a clear structure or an incentive to replace that, or at least reduce it, right? And that's just how it is with all technology. That's not new with AI. This is true for every type of technology. When a new type of technology comes, some jobs transform, disappear completely, some others come, right? And so what's important there for governments is really not to say, well, we don't know what the future will look like. Let's just wait and see how it plays out. Because while I do agree, we don't know what kind of jobs will be going away and which one will come in its place. The thing that we already know is that people want to pay their rent. Like people will always want to pay their rent and want to have certain types of securities. And so I think if the future is uncertain, good advice is not to wait. Good advice is to prepare for the worst. And that means thinking about, okay, what can we do if certain jobs are at risks? What can we do to incentivize companies to actually create new jobs? What kind of government structures are possible to make sure that those jobs are also worth having? Because, there's a clear difference in job quality and salary and job security from jobs that are now created to the ones that we had 10, 15, 30 years ago. And so there is a tendency where policymakers could already do something without having to wait how it all plays out. So more proactive policymaking to think about how technology can be used to help us be better at certain things without threatening our livelihood.
Yeah, thank
Could
you.
I just add to so
Yes.
Elke, part of your question there was about humans, and you mentioned, in your Gunther Anders quote, without us. And I think there's a lot of talk about humans and us as the sort of relevant category when it comes to AI. And especially when we're talking about threats, especially when we're talking about worst case scenarios, this sort of sometimes has tended towards some really peculiar extreme thinking. So I've just done a program for the BBC, for BBC Radio, an episode of Analysis on this idea that AI will pose an existential threat, right? That genuinely, the challenge with AI is that it's going to wipe out humanity, right? Which is an idea, obviously, that we've all heard about in science fiction, but is also an idea that runs through computer science and is taken extraordinarily seriously and has a lot of backing, financial and cultural backing. And I want to know where this idea came from. And I think it's partly this convenient categorization of humans as us, as the relevant stakeholder group, right? I look at technologies and I don't see a battle between technology and humanity, right? Because that's a very weird way to start a policy conversation. I see a set of political struggles that involve some people and other people, and those people have interests. So when we talk about AI doing things to us, I think we should be much clearer that it will always be some humans using technology to gain power over other humans. And I think there's a real tendency within AI, and it's bound up in this idea of intelligence and the threat to us, and the idea that, as Sandra was saying, obviously technologies are better than us at doing particular things. AI comes along and its purveyors claim that the technology will be better than us at everything, better than us, right? And so it is constructed as this battle between technologies and between a technology and all people. It was never that, and that again is one of these distractions from the actual political struggles that we need to engage in.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's why Norbert Wiener's book for the masses was called The Human Use of Human Beings. And it was about cybernetics ultimately, but I think he understood that relatively early on, that there are always humans that can harness innovation for more power. I incidentally have some thoughts about this existential risk discourse, which I think is an apocalyptic kind of eschatological type of discourse, which again is about power, political power. And I would say that maybe Anders didn't always acknowledge the fact that we're always technologically enhanced as humans. So it isn't really us and them, but it is politically useful, I think, to cast it in those ways.
So there's a really interesting book that came out relatively recently by Pasquinelli, A New Social History of AI, right, where the historiography of that, so the new history that he's drawing is to say, this is not a history of technology, it's a history of industrialization and capital exerting control over labor. And actually that's how to see trajectories of automation and datification and all the rest of it. And I think you can tell completely different stories about AI that, might bring you to the same point, but mean that you're likely to ask very different questions.
Yeah, it's a really good book. I Have the Master, I think it's called.
I Have the Master, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, what time is it actually? Okay, maybe I'll start opening it up to the audience, because I could probably talk for forever, but maybe we'll bring you in so this is not just a listening exercise. Any questions for our experts? Yeah. All right, go ahead.
I'll borrow your mic. I'll borrow your mic.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you very much for the a very lovely conversation. I want to ask maybe a bit more about this black boxes situation. Huh? So if there's a black box in principle, or is it a black box due to, you know, by business privacy, in the sense like algorithms which are what's it called, you know, proprietary algorithms, so forth? Because I mean, I'm just, I mean, I don't know if we need to go into specifics of technology, but in a sense, you know, there is no such thing as a neural network, in the sense there is a neural network in the brain. I mean, neural networks are implemented in traditional computing ways. They are implemented in traditional algorithm structures. Huh? So in a sense, I'm just wondering if you went, I assume, as far as I remember my computer science days, I assume that, you know, if you were to go line by line of the code of this algorithm, which simulates, emulates a neural network, I assume you would be able to track, you know, which node has which weight. You know, you would be able to track this formula which assigns weights to connections between neurons, no? And you would be able to assume what should come out when you give it an input on one side, now after you've trained. Huh? So that's my question. So is it really that it's a black box, or is it a black box due to proprietary issues? Thanks.
Thanks, Sandra.
Yes, so it's both. So there are two reasons why people don't want to explain their algorithms, either because they don't know how it works or because they don't want to tell you. So one is definitely because intellectual property rights protect people from having to disclose the trade secrets of their inventions. So there is a situation often that does happen in many, many cases where you could actually explain how the algorithm makes decisions, but proprietary interests will prohibit that. But then there is a second type of black box, and sometimes there's intersection, obviously, that really has to do with the limitations of technology. Again, coming back to this distinction between the rule-based models and those where you don't fully understand them. There are many, so the ones where you understand the rules, that's easy, that you can have like an understanding of how it actually works. But with the more complex ones, it gets more difficult. And so there are ways, I'm not saying that there aren't any methods of actually explaining of what's going on. It's just a question of how reliable that is. Like the input-output thing that you mentioned, sensitivity testing is what you're talking about, right? It's like techniques like LIMES where you try, so you have input here, in the middle is the black box, and then you have the output. And sensitivity testing, or with LIME where you can do that, is you change the output here, and then you see how it changes the output on the other side. And then you try to create a simplistic model, basically trying to understand the reaction that it has, right? And you're trying to create a probabilistic, simplistic model of that. The issue is just that those are not necessarily super reliable. They're super reliable, more reliable if you want to just explain a little part of the algorithm, but as soon as you want to explain everything, it gets more complicated and less reliable because that thing just behaves in very unpredictable ways. So you can have either just explain something that is very short and reliable, or something that is long, but not necessarily gives you the full truth of the whole picture. So that doesn't mean that this is a thing that won't go away at some point. It's just like the techniques that we currently have don't fully tell you the logic of the algorithm yet. And we have worked on this I have worked with Chris Russell, who's a computer scientist, and with Brent Middlestead, an ethicist, worked on counterfactual explanation. So techniques where you can understand a little bit how and why certain inputs and how they had an impact on an individual decision, for example. So there are techniques where you can do that. But having the full understanding of how the entire algorithm works, that is still a problem. So we are very good at understanding individual cases, but fully understanding the whole logic of an algorithm, we're not there yet. And again, give it a couple more years of development, maybe we'll get there. I'm just saying this because from a regulatory perspective, the problem still remains. It might be okay for a computer scientist to say, okay, I don't fully understand how the whole algorithm works, and it doesn't necessarily bother me for my purposes. But from a regulator's perspective and a public policy perspective, that might still be a problem, because only understanding 20% of an algorithm is not ideal if you're sending people to prison with it. And so there's a question independent from that, how we should react with law to the problem that in some cases we don't fully understand it yet. And so again, it really depends on, you know, what the purpose of explainability is. Is it to help the coder understand the code better, or is it so people can make sure that the decisions that are being made about them are actually fair and accurate? But yeah, I work on that as well, and find this super interesting.
Jackie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, so Sandra, I mean, I'm gonna go from the sublime to the ridiculous now. I mean, Sandra's work has been absolutely key to understanding not just the sort of technical feasibility of explainability, but also some of the incentives against it. And I think, you know, one thing I would highlight from a social science point of view is that explainability has been given far too little attention by the AI community because of a sort of privileging of outcomes over processes that, you know, and it's not just a question of, are these inevitably black boxes, but what are the processes of black boxing that have been going on within computer science? And there, my main intellectual source would be the final scene of The Wizard of Oz, where, you know, there is this little man trying to convince people that he is magic. A dog pulls away his curtain, and the little man says into the microphone, "Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain." Right? And there are lots of incentives to keep this pretense that the technology is magical. And if we were somehow to find some way to open up these black boxes and work out that actually they're made up of wax and string, then that would be, you know, demystifying in ways that would damage the story of some AI developers. So there are lots of incentives towards mystifying. So it was a really interesting piece that Alex Campolo and Kate Crawford brought out recently, where they came out with this nice phrase, enchanted determinism, to characterize the story of AI, which is this idea that it is inevitable and it is magic and it is impenetrable, and our job as society should be to marvel at these creations rather than to ask these difficult questions. And the questions about what's going on inside the black box are undeniably difficult ones.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm Aslan, I'm an actor and a technology scientist. And last year I was at the Equity Conference as a delegate for London North Branch. And we had the policy, obviously, because AI stopped stealing the show, because it was a big thing. But I went there as also a technology scientist to explain that all it is just a tool. It started back in the 1950s with Alan Turing. Back then we had people typing on the typewriters, and it converted into the laptops and PCs. Before, it's just, you know, every stage of industrial revolution, and this is where we are at now. We're on the 4th industrial revolution, where it is now AI. Yeah. So instead of being afraid of it because we don't know, because we haven't actually played around with the technology and we haven't actually gone and, let's say, for example, after that event, finding out that everyone was so afraid of it, actually started going to NHS hospitals and actually sharing the tools for cancer research, for expediting, especially for Great Ormond Street Hospice children, because I had a lot of people that died from cancer, and it saddened me because people were so afraid to not play around with technology that they were like, oh, I'm not even going to touch it, because it's everyone like in here talks about, oh, let's talk about these things, and people die because people don't want to explore these new technologies. So luckily, I've done a healthcare hackathon with UCL where I partnered up with them, and I've actually shared the technologies, how, for example, I'll give you one, Consensus. It's just the AI research tool to expedite new PhD professors that, research, publish those papers on Google. You can get it in seconds because all it does is an application programming interface link to these databases, whereas before you had to go on Google, spend hours and hours and hours to find these research papers. Now you can get it in seconds. It's about prompt engineering, working on your language, and there's actually it's even better with AI because now we're actually looking more on the language of what we how speak and how creative we are with the language than actually on the coding, because now the future is the elimination of programming languages. So actually we're giving power to those who are not techie, because back then you have to have knowledge of C#, C++, Java, whatever. And it's crazy. Those, like, no one needs to know these like random languages, but now you can just, with English, direct compute with an AI, and you're actually giving the powers to those bottom up workers, because those senior management people, directors, they already know this. They already know these, how to manage and how to, but with AI and giving the power to the normal working class people to be able to access these PhD documents, you're giving them knowledge, you're giving them tools, you're giving them something that they've never been able to have before. And this is great. And in terms of policymaking, so I was at the European Union Economic Social Committee last month in Brussels. And again, 109 delegates, everyone was afraid of AI, and I convinced the whole Europe that, listen, it is the tools of AI that we are going to fix the world, because it is the top-down shareholders and top-down pharma companies that have all this control in policy, right? And it is us who they don't want, they on purpose misinform us about this technology because they don't want us to have this power and realize, oh, actually, there's something wrong. And I've convinced him, and we actually recommended for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive before 6th of March, it was on pause. And now, because of our recommendation as a youth priority, 18 to 25, it's back on track now. It's on the final legal hurdle on the 24th of April. And I'm actually going back to the European Parliament now. So before it was a committee, now I'm going to the Parliament tomorrow to Brussels. So I'm going to push for quantum technologies. With quantum technologies, all it is, it's chemistry simulations in the memory of a computer in a minute. So before labs, we have to spend years for cancer research to find like compatible medicine. Now we can actually do it in a computer in a minute, find new materials for proteins, for medicine treatment, battery solutions for environment, and also it's the material, it's chemistry, right? And we actually save money on not spending a lot of time and money on chemistry. And at the end of the day, what is it? It's an augmentation tool, because at the end of the day, you do these simulations, you use this, it's like Google. You have to have a human at the end to do the real life practice at the end to review it. So that was it. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Strong advocacy for the
Cancer research and for the environment.
Okay, did you want to respond?
Yes, can I please? I know this was more a comment than a question, but I still feel like that I would like to say something about this. I think it's really, really important to distinguish between the types of technologies that we can implement. I would fully agree that automating safe processes or digitalizing analog processes, that is something where we can save time and money and resources, especially when it comes to healthcare. I don't think anybody is against the idea of having more efficient ways to getting access to documents that a doctor or that nurses need. I don't think anybody's arguing against that. But to say that we should just blindly implement AI for diagnosis and decision-making and for cancer treatment and cancer detection is really, really dangerous. And it's really, really dangerous because there is a lot of scientific evidence that those systems are not working well for a lot of communities in our society. They're working not well for women. They're not working well for people of color because the input data is highly biased. And we have done a lot of research and actually worked with the NHS on that as well, where we showed that a lot of the bias tools that are allegedly there to improve medical diagnostics are doing the opposite. They're actually decreasing accuracy. So it's really, really important to have a more nuanced understanding of what kind of tools are actually good for healthcare and what tools are actually hurting those in our society that are already being marginalized.
Thank you, Sandra.
I mean, I don't know where to begin. So the way that you present AI, in a philosopher of technology would say that that's an instrumental view of a technology, right? Where a technology is a tool that can be used for good or bad purposes. I think we need to do better than that. I think we need to look at, so one way to do the job that Sandra identifies of working out good and bad uses of AI is to look at those sort of contextual factors. So, you know, in the NHS, I would be relatively confident as a user of NHS services that AI can and might be developed in ways that are robust, that are well tested, that are fair, if the best of the NHS is applied to the job of technology assessment there. It's not going to do that by itself. If I was in the creative industries, I would worry about the uses of AI systems to disempower creators, because creators are already disempowered in various ways, right? So I've written a bit about AI and music. I think this is a really interesting domain, because you know, musicians knew the gig economy long before the gig economy was called the gig economy. They are relatively powerless workers and have every right to feel that their creative endeavors are jeopardized by technologies. That isn't to say that musicians don't also make use of new technologies, but they do it on their own terms. So the question is how the technologies can be, and the question is whether technologies can be developed in ways that actually do have broad benefits. If we look at examples like Google, I think we could all see that, yes, we have all benefited in exciting, surprising, as well as boring sort of productivity ways from the development of Google's technologies, but also Google has benefited, and it's benefited in ways that have harmed other people, right? In particular, you know, some owners of intellectual property. It's led to a concentration of industries in ways that are problematic, as well as. So if we don't ask these questions, right, if we blindly just go in and say, should we be pro or anti this technology, then we're missing an opportunity to genuinely make things better. Hoping for the best is not a good policy strategy.
Yeah, I think the question generally also is whose agency is actually amplified with these technologies and whose agency is diminished, and in what ways is an important question.
The mic is, can you put the mic closer to you, to Mo?
I've lost the mic.
Oh.
I will now go to the audience. One more audience question, then we
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry.
Who should I go to?
There was a question.
Hi, I've got an anecdote and a couple of questions. So I'm a robot. Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. So I work with robots. So we did an experiment where we had people try to use sort of a strong AI and a weak AI to aid controlling a robot. And in the feedback session, one of the participants told us that, okay, working with this weak AI felt like correcting mistakes in arithmetic in a kindergarten student, and working with a strong AI felt like correcting mistakes in a college essay. So what we sort of get as feedback mostly is that when people, like, I'm sure you would have used ChatGPT, like if you're using it for sort of just random skeleton generation versus hardcore research writing or something, you realize you actually comb through every line and end up rewriting almost every line yourself, to the point that you just feel that AI was training wheels. So when you put this AI into an embodied agent in the future, you're going to sort of inherit all of these problems on an accountability level, because traditionally we sort of thought about accountability as trusting a subordinate or a supervisor or a peer, because you can fire them at the end of the day, or they are motivated just as you. So how do you see accountability changing in the future, and how do you think we're going to start like holding X accountable because it's a black box, or holding X accountable because it's generating content? So that's the first question. The second question is, do you feel there are sort of parallels or lessons that you can learn from anything in the past, like the Gutenberg press or something, or the proliferation of religion or something like that? And do you think there are some lessons that you can learn from any sort of watershed moment in the past? And if you could speak to that a bit.
Good question. Jack, I'll start with you.
So again, let me just twist that question. The question I don't think should be, how will accountability change, right? Let's ask the democratic question. How do we think accountability should change? Where should accountability lie in those sorts of circumstances? Because otherwise, we risk exacerbating some of the trends that we've already seen, which is a form of sort of organized irresponsibility. In terms of lessons from the past, I mean, again, I would look at the regulation of past technologies. Think about, a genuinely transformative technology like the motor car, right? The emergence of the motor car, particularly in America, was a really, really interesting historical trajectory where there were clear benefits, and the benefits were pretty obvious to most people. And initially, though it started as a rich person's plaything, right? With the arrival of the Model T and things, it became accessible as a middle class technology. But there were real democratic questions about accountability, about how to share the benefits of that technology, about who should get blamed when things go wrong. And in lots of places, the way that things got sorted out when drivers of cars killed children, for example, where systems emerged, legal systems, but also then subsequently hard concrete infrastructures emerged to benefit drivers over pedestrians, right? Because in effect, society was making a decision that the benefits of the technology outweighed the risks. Now, many people would say that those decisions were fateful, consequential ones that could have been better, right? That you end up with places like Phoenix, Arizona that are horrible. You end up with 40,000 people dying in the US every year as a result of that technology. Lots of those deaths could be prevented, okay? But that as a result of a particular set of questions about accountability. I think that discussion could have been had in ways that were fairer and more just, while still getting the benefits of that technology. And indeed, if you look at the way that the motor car has evolved in other countries in the world, you see more just, more responsible evolutions of that technology. We have to do the same thing with artificial intelligence, rather than just saying, what will a world be like with robots in it? Remember that it's not the robots that are making those decisions, it's the people that are developing the robots that are making the decisions.
Sandra.
Yeah, so from a legal perspective, I think I can definitely see like a trend over the last decades away from hard regulation to much more co-regulation, or even just self-regulation or no regulation at all. And I think that's an interesting evolution that I think is challenging in certain areas. So when it comes to AI at the moment, apart from like the European Union, everybody is still quite hesitant to think about like hard enforceable regulation that deals with actual liability and questions of getting recourse if something happens, or being held accountable if something fails. And so it's interesting how that's has emerged over the last couple of decades. And I really hope that with enough pushback, we come back to a more reasonable approach where we find a good middle ground between hard and soft regulation. But I can definitely see that there is a troubling trend. And I think I really like your question about history. I think about that a lot as well. And the car is actually a really interesting example. So when the car first came around, one of the fears that people had, some of the risks that people anticipated was that the speeds that the speeds that you're going to be exposed to when you're traveling in a car is going to injure your organs. That was a thought that people had when the automobile first came around. So scientists and very smart people back then did think that, you know, traveling in a car has an impact on your internal organs. Obviously, that wasn't correct at all. So back then, we didn't anticipate the right risk, but we also didn't anticipate the actual underlying risk, which is, for example, environmental impact. It took us decades to understand how the automobile actually contributes to climate change, which just means that we're really bad at anticipating and predicting the future, which is quite interesting that we're so obsessed with AI now, as if that's going to be better at it somehow. And so what that means is that I think we just have to be very, very diligent and humble in terms of understanding the risks, and have to have like a constant iterative process with science, where we can have a better understanding of what technology can and cannot do. And being open to be wrong about our assumptions and not sticking with it and defending it if new evidence comes to light that we were actually wrong. And so that will be better, I think, in terms of figuring out what kind of risks are realistic and the ones that we should care less about, and then hopefully find that type of regulation that does the right thing. And sometimes self-regulation is absolutely acceptable, but sometimes you need hard regulation. I wonder how many people would step on a plane if airfare was not hard regulated, but was done by codes of conduct and gentlemen's agreement between the big manufacturers of planes, right? So sometimes hard regulation is really good. And the same comes true for cars, where we do have hard regulation and codes of conduct don't really work. So just finding the right middle ground and finding the right tool is really, really important. But you can only do that if you have iterative processes of risk assessment with independent scientists that can tell you, this is what we think is going to happen, but are going to be open to the idea that they also might be wrong about something.
Okay, great. Yes.
Do you have any comments from online?
Sure.
Yeah. Couple comments from online. I can summarize them hopefully fairly. There's a question for Sandra about your opinion on UK and EU regulation on AI, and a more general comment about what AI can do to other non-humans, such as animals.
Yes, so both super important questions. I don't think I have enough time to explain how much what I think about the AI Act in all detail. So I'm gonna just try to summarize it in like 3 sentences. I don't want to bore you with ranting about EU law. I think it's really, really good that we have the AI Act. I was worried that we might not get it. Like, it was just recently actually decided that we're going to have it in a couple of years. And I think it's a hallmark piece of legislation. And it's so much better than having nothing. So it's really, really good. And I'm very proud that it was possible to actually pass it, even though there was a lot of lobbying against that framework. But there's always a but, obviously. I think there are things that could have been better. I think I'm not particularly happy with how open we were to allow certain technologies to be implemented in our society. I'm not particularly happy that we're going to have the ability to have wide-scale face recognition software being implemented in public places. I'm not particularly happy with the fact that we have the ability to implement emotion detection software for immigration purposes. I'm not really happy that we didn't fully ban predictive policing. Those would have been things where I thought there would have been an opportunity to be stricter. because the benefits just do not outweigh the risks and the harms that could come from it. And in general, I'm just not very happy, and this leads back to the previous comment that I made, that a lot of that framework is, again, based on self-assessment. So that means that you, as a developer of an AI system, you have to follow the rules, but you are also the one that gets to decide or assess or certify if you think that your product actually is legally compliant. And that is, again, not good. Just imagine that, you know, Airbus or Boeing, I mean, Boeing, who knows? Boeing is actually a good example. They did have self-regulation, self-assessment. The reason why the planes crashed is because it was self-regulation. It's actually an excellent example of why self-regulation is not a good idea. But again, you can see if you just leave it to private companies to self-assess whether they think that their products are legally compliant, liability is just around the corner. But, and I'm going to close with the good part of it, is to say that there are ways to improve that still. And I just wrote a paper on that where I talk about the intricacies of the AI Act and how certain things could be implemented further down the line in the next couple of months or so to actually close some of the loopholes. But I'm not going to bore you with that. If anybody's interested, I can send you the paper on that. And just one sentence in relation to animals and the environment in general. Yes, we haven't actually talked about that, the environmental impact of those models on the environment. That's really, really important. And I think the stochastic parrots paper is a wonderful resource for that, which I think was one of the seminal papers that actually really, really very well showed that this is a problem. It's not just a bias problem, a misinformation problem, but those systems need electricity. Those systems need water. They need land. Communities are being displaced. Animals are being killed. People are left with very poor living conditions, and the wildlife suffers from it. And so it's really, really important to think about the environmental and wildlife costs that we pay if we use and train those systems, because they don't grow on trees. They're not fair trade systems. They cost a lot of life and environment.
Yeah, good point. Jack.
I think, Sandra, you said it. All I'd add is that I think one of the features of this very sort of solipsistic view of AI, where we see it through the lens of our own human intelligence, is that we ignore these sorts of wider environmental questions, which would include, you know, animals and ecosystems, as well as the unsustainability of, you know, carbon emissions and water use, you know, rare earth minerals, the extraordinary. I mean, you can see it. You can see the materiality of AI in recent stock market movements. Nvidia has, over the last year, become a $2 trillion company because they have a de facto monopoly on the best chips, right? Making those things requires real minerals that have to come from other parts of the world where, you know, you're entangled in economies and patterns of human labor that might be problematic. But if we think that this is some sort of imagined battle between what humans can do and what computers can do, and a sort of battle of intelligences, then we miss all of that stuff, and that should be part of our governance conversation.
Definitely. There's an interesting piece of artwork that Kate Crawford and Ladan Yoler did, this anatomy of an AI, which gives you a fantastic planetary scale of all the stuff that goes into the labor and materials into just, you know, a single AI system. It's a fantastic piece of work. John, how are we doing for time?
We still have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. More questions. The back here.
From the discussion, you seem to have been highlighting two main points with issues with AI. The first of, in the systems itself, that it's making the wrong decisions in terms of biases, and in the second, in terms of the way people will be using these systems. So what sort of regulations will address these two issues respectively?
No, I think so. Sandra might have captured some of that in her previous answer about the EU AI Act. You know, I think regulation. So just to sort of finish, maybe to round out that picture, to my characterization of the UK's approach to regulation, which is, I think, a problematic one, is that it focuses on the second of your problematics in your question there, which that question of what AI will do, right? So the UK regulation, simply put, I think is a sort of wait and see approach. Rather than saying this is what we would like AI to do, it's so the rhetoric from British policymakers is that ours is a pro-innovation approach to AI, which is, I think, nonsense, because it suggests that other approaches would be anti-innovation. But you know, government rhetoric is typically nonsense. So I think any sufficiently rounded form of AI regulation needs to just deal with not just what AI does, but also that with the first part, which is how AI is constituted. Ideas of, I don't think it's just about data and the sort of inputs to AI. It's also about how AI works and the purposes through which it's developed. But Sandra might be able to add thoughts on how regulation does and doesn't deal with those two bits.
Yeah, not that well yet. I'm working with the European Commission on this, and hopefully there will be some changes further down the line. Because unfortunately, very often people just say, oh, you know, bias is not a new thing. We had bias and injustice for as long as humanity exists, and we have non-discrimination laws. Let's just apply those to AI. And let's go home because there's no new issue there. And it's really, really important to say, yes, we are not in a situation where there aren't any non-discrimination laws, but it's really important to acknowledge and to accept that the new biases that are being created are not captured by the current law at all. And that's not a failing of the law and not a failing of the technologies. It's a very unfortunate mismatch of how technology has evolved and the types of risks that we have seen when humans were the alone decision makers. So an example would be, you know, you have protected classes under non-discrimination law where you are not allowed, for example, to say, I'm not giving you the job because you're a woman, because you're Black, because you're gay, right? So that's illegal in most circumstances, in most jurisdictions. And so what algorithms do is they can create proxy classes where people are not aware that it is actually a proxy. So for example, there could be a correlation between liking the color green and being gay. Not causality, but there could be a correlation. It actually goes back to research that was done in the 19th century, where I say, quote unquote, smart people, scientists back in the day, did believe that people, if they like the color green or red, they're gay. It's absolute nonsense. It's debunked research. It has no basis in fact or science or anything, but there was a period in time where smart people did think that your favorite color says something about your sexuality. Algorithms can be similarly dumb. They might just find signals, some kind of correlation, and we don't bother to figure out what the causality between those two things is. And the algorithm might just think that liking the color green or red is somehow linked with being gay. And so if you're then being asked during a job interview, what is your favorite color? You don't even know that somebody just found out something about your sexuality, right? And the law doesn't really cover that, right? And that's an issue. In the same way that it is an issue that it's based on a complaint-based system, that discrimination always requires somebody to know that they have been disadvantaged. Well, if algorithms do this behind your back, you don't even know about it. So you will never go to court and bring a claim because it happened behind your back. You don't even know that you have been analyzed, right? And so those are a couple of things that just show that the current laws that we currently have them do not work. Again, because they weren't designed for algorithms as decision makers, they were designed for humans as decision makers. And so this is really, really important. And yeah, I wrote a couple of papers on all of that, and I'm happy they're all publicly available. But that's really, really important to always ask ourselves the question, are the current laws good enough to deal with the novel risks a certain technology brings? And more often than not, the answer is no. And again, this is where you have to be open to think about new regulation and not just say, we had those issues forever and therefore everything is fine. So keeping fingers crossed that hopefully there will be some updates to some of those regulations, because I'm working with legislators to hopefully bring about some amendments on that issue.
Okay, great. We'll do a final round of questions. I'm going to take a couple of questions. So I have one here and then a lady next. And then I think you also had a question.
Cool, thank you. You all emphasized the importance of clarifying the purpose of AI-powered technologies prior to development and deployment. So yeah, whether it's clarifying their intended benefit or what problems they're intended to fix. Do you see any role that like regular citizens in general, the general public can play in determining the answers to those questions? And if yes, what do you think are the best ways the public participation can actually occur?
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. It was an inspiring talk to both of the speakers. Having heard John talking about monopolies, I thought I would raise my question now as a competition lawyer. Historically speaking, as we all know, anything which represents power required to be regulated in order to control or regulate the power which might be abused to the disadvantage of humanity, like be it property laws, industrial revolution, IP rights, and today big data obviously requires one way or another some sort of regulation that we're talking about. What I understand from your comments is that a kind of a fixed menu for any kind of AI would not be possible. There should be some sort of classification in order for the regulation not to kill innovation, so to say. So I wonder whether national efforts would be sufficient to regulate and first classify, make that classification, and then regulate such an unlimited power in terms of geography, time, whatsoever. And secondly, again, what I understand, there's even with the question of our colleague there, some of which I didn't understand at all, there is an obvious asymmetry of information between the regulators and the AI producers. How to overcome this asymmetry of information if an efficient regulation or workable regulation is aimed is also one of the questions which came to my mind as a lawyer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Is there a question over here or did I? Yes, okay. That is the final question and then I'll hand it back to the panel.
Really enjoyed the session, really great. I work in a technology risk role commercially, do a lot of time doing privacy impact assessments and algorithmic impact assessments, that kind of thing. At the moment, it feels very much like a checkbox effort. From a commercial perspective, often you'll submit a report and highlight harms, and then the client will often just ignore them. If I'm frankly honest, it's a bit of a bullshit job. The AI Act to me was really interesting because I think, you know, we see one sort of region bringing legislation in, hard regulation. But I'm conscious that you talked about existential threat. You know, I get the sense that other countries, other parts of the world see it as an adversarial advantage if they don't regulate some of these technologies. There's this sort of inherent sort of sense that, well, if we just let people play with the fire, we might end up with a better outcome. So I just was interested in your views on that, really.
Great, thank you. I'll start with you, Jack, and then we'll.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just take I'll try and cover all three in some way. So public participation is I think absolutely key, and I think I'm really pleased that you drew the connection between this question of purposes and public participation, because I think you're right that most people looking at AI, their question would instinctively be, well, what is it for? And maybe sort of talking in bureaucratic, even technocratic terms about regulation, you lose track of that very sort of fundamental question, which underpins the ultimate question of politics, which is, what the good life is, what sort of futures do we see, how do we contest those futures, and come to some agreements about them. Throughout my career, I've worked a lot on a sort of micro form of public participation, which more recently has taken the form of some people talk about citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, that sort of thing. One thing that we did recently, I say we, it wasn't me, I was just part of the advisory group, around the AI summit that took place, Rishi Sunak's AI summit that took place in November. There was a fringe, and as part of that fringe set of events, an organization called Connected by Data did a people's panel on AI that was really interesting, and I was privileged to sit in on some of their discussions and see a sort of microcosm of public empowerment, where, if you like, 12 people, randomly selected people, had been told, your opinions matter, talk about AI and tell us what you think. I would advise anybody to look up their report, because there is so much wisdom in their deliberations, and it's the sort of thing that policy can easily learn from. There's all sorts of reasons why policy and why companies choose not to learn from those things. But I think one of the urgent tasks ahead of us, especially given the speed of movement, is to try to democratize this discussion. And we can do it in directly democratic ways that I think are really interesting. At the other end of things, and let me just, maybe I'll just end with something about this. So monopolies, I think, is a really interesting way. And I completely agree that I think, if you problematize AI as power, rather than looking at the technical bits, you say, okay, if this is a concentration of power, if there is something inevitably monopolistic or oligopolistic about this, then is that an issue, and how should it be an issue? Is it inevitable? I think would be the first question. At the moment, all the running is being done by a very small number of companies, and there are definitely economies of scale. But if it's, why not bring all the weapons of corporate law and economics to bear on monopolistic and oligopolistic market structures, and say, okay, let's talk about antitrust. Let's talk about, if this is a natural monopoly, let's talk about turning it into a utility, right? Let's talk about public ownership. You can start having those sorts of discussions without much consideration of the technological novelty here. I think it's really interesting. Well, one of the ways that discussion is playing out in regulatory terms is in terms of national sovereignty. It's sort of inevitably, with any technology, it takes on a security framing. So there are, various governments are talking about sovereign capacities for AI, and whether you need government capacity for AI if this is going to be a security critical conversation. Maybe I'll just stand there and let Sandra pick up on the rest.
Okay, over to you, Sandra.
Yeah, I think all three questions ultimately ask about power, right? And I think that's a very good thing to think about. Very often there's this rhetoric of like, AI is here to stay, either jump on the bandwagon or be left behind. But look who is talking, right? Look who is saying those things. It's the people who have a financial interest that you use those systems. And it's really, really important to change the narrative. It's really, really important to regain self-confidence, because the power is not with those who innovate. The power is with those who buy and implement, right? They need us much more than we need them. And that's how it is. But they have somehow just convinced us that we are already depending on them. And that's just not the case, right? And that will give us more confidence to think about regulation in a different way. In the same way that whenever, you know, regulation is brought to the table, they say, oh, it's gonna stifle innovation. Well, does it? Does it? Regulation about planes leads to planes not crashing anymore. Yes, the type of innovation that kills people is being hampered, but the type of innovation that lands people safely at Heathrow, that is being pushed forward, right? And that's happening. We have to think about regulation is not there to hold anything back that is good. It's trying to give guide rails so innovation is safe and useful. And that's really, again, important to keep in mind. Similarly, when people say, oh, if you regulate too much, they will leave the market. But do they? Have they ever? No, they don't. They stay. You know, it's a big market. Why would they leave? They have a shareholder obligation. They have to make more profit. They can't just leave. They're just telling us that they would. And can I remind you of the story of a couple of months back in Italy, where Italy, the Data Protection Authority in Italy, said to OpenAI, you are violating GDPR, you have to shut down production. Within 3 days, they changed the business practices. So it's just a question of power and self-confidence and just readjusting that. We are not the ones that have to run after them, it's the other way around. And if we just regain that balance back, I think good regulation come into force that will hold back the bad thing and will, you know, bring forth innovation that is actually useful to the majority of people.
Fantastic. What an uplifting note to end on. Thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.
Please, outside there is
refreshing
hot food.
Oh, okay. Food. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Sandra,
so much.
for joining.
It's great seeing you.
And thank you for the audience online. Thank you all, and bye now.